Okay, so tonight we're going to cover some of the pre-engagement interactions, the items required when you start a penetration test. So we're going to cover that tonight. And so this website that we're navigated to, pentest-standard.org. This is the penetration execution standard, and this is a really good source. There's other options out there, but yeah, someone asked, you said copy and paste doesn't work. Correct. Copy and paste will work inside of that, but you can't copy and paste from within the lab to your host. So you can copy and paste internally to those VMs, but you can't copy and paste to your host system. So there's other standards out there, but this is one of the ones that's most commonly used. Even in our book, they cover it. If you look at a lot of different pen testing books, usually contain this information. But just to kind of give you some idea of the people that wrote this and why this is a good standard, is if you look at the list of some of these people that helped write this, you have Dave Kennedy from Trusted Sec. Let's see, you have Justin Searle. He works for InGuardians. He is also a SANS instructor. You have Carlos Perez, Joe McCrae, Chris Gates. Actually, Chris Gates, I was supposed to have dinner with him this week while I was in town, but his wife's schedule wouldn't let him make it. I guess he has to babysit, so he couldn't make it out. So I almost got to have dinner with him. We just recently connected. And then John Strand from Black Hills Information Security Group. So you see a list of a lot of people on here. I think, I'm trying to think if Rob Fuller's on here or not, but so who's list of people in penetration testing. So this kind of shows you the quality of this this work. And so this splits pen tests out into these different sections. So pre-engagement is what we're going to cover here tonight, and we'll cover some of the intelligence, because we'll get, the first night was supposed to be or the reconnaissance is going to be passive OSINT. And so I definitely, you should go through this once you get a chance to go through here. And so you see so we're in the pre-engagement phase. So you see it covers the overview, introduction to scope, metrics for time estimate, scoping meeting, additional support based on hourly rate, questionnaires. And these questionnaires are to help you scope the pen test. And they have it broken down into different sections. So you got network pen tests, web application pen tests, wireless, physical, social, and then question for business units and system administrators. So the more of the information you have, the better you can accomplish the goal of the pen test. Scope creep. So if the pen test starts going a little bit over time, maybe you found something that needed to be tested that wasn't in the scope. This is where the scope creep, where scope creep comes into play. So you just have to adjust how you're going to deal with adding extra scope. If you had extra IPs and those type of things. So this is where you address that. And then you specify your start and end dates, and then specify IP ranges and domains. So this is where your targets and validate ranges. This is when you get the information, you make sure it's correct and valid. One of the things with validating ranges, if it's an external pen test, then you definitely want to check your network blocks and make sure they belong to that person that gave you those IP addresses. Sometimes they may accidentally type the IP address in wrong, and you can end up pen testing the wrong company. And as I said, you have to have permission to perform a pen test. And so you don't want, if you're performing a test against another company, then that's without permission. You could get in trouble if you cause an outage. I've actually had this happen before, where the customer gave me the wrong IP addresses and I was testing it, and then come back and sent them, actually there was no one, I guess it'd be hard to know if there was any problems, because it would be hard for them to contact you. They're not going to know who to contact, someone that's been wrongly tested. But I've had that happen, and the customer came up and looked at the results. These are not our IP addresses. And so you definitely need to validate, make sure that you got the right place And this could be validating the address if you're doing a physical assessment too. You're dealing with third parties, so that your third parties, you got all these apps going to cloud now. So you have to get permission from these different third parties, and also check the testing times. A lot of companies are really, cloud companies are really particular. They'll let you pen test, but you need permission from them, and set the times and all that. So this different managed service providers, countries where servers are hosted. When you run into this, you can, with this scenario, the laws are different in each country. So you want to make sure that you're within the bounds of the laws there. So you want to test, check to see what countries you're testing in, because so many companies are global now. So you just see an IP address, you're not going to be sure what country. So you need to go through and look at the blocks and ranges, and then during your talks, up front, find out what countries some of these resources are in, and then validate that on your own. But just that you want to keep that in mind, and define acceptable social engineering pretexts to just make sure what's safe for inbound and acceptable by the customer for the pen testing, what kind of scenario you're going to use. And this is something that social engineering is not always used. Sometimes it's part of a big project. A lot of times it's used in red teaming, because a lot of times sending phishing emails are one of the prime ways that red teamers get a foothold into the network. DOS testing, most companies don't want DOS testing done, but there are cases of where they may do this after hours to make sure that it's not vulnerable to denial of service attacks. Although there are some Metasploit tools that are exploits that are DOS exploits, but you can also do a check with it to test to see if it's vulnerable. So you can validate, there's ways to validate without actually performing a denial of service. And then you get into your payment terms, your net 30, half upfront, reoccurring costs, and then goals of the pen test. This is important is the goals of the pen test. So you want to make sure you're successful in accomplishing what the customer needs. And when you're doing this, you need to really work with them, find out what their goals are, and provide your experience on what needs to be done to achieve those goals, and work with them. A lot of times customers that have had a lot of pen tests done, they have a pretty good idea how they want this done, but some people with less experience, then it's really up to you to help them adjust their goals. And establishing lines of communication. So you want to have contacts so they can contact you as the pen tester, your project manager, in your chain of command in case there's an outage, they can't get a hold of you. And this also goes into our emergency contact information. So you want to know their incident reporting process, incident definition, and the frequency they want to be updated on the report. I've seen some people that want like once a week, and some people that want daily updates. Companies that are used to having pen tests done regularly, usually once a week is typically the most they do. And then PGP and other alternatives. This is the way you're going to be transferring files and communicating. So you want to make sure you're not sending stuff in clear text or storing it on an insecure platform where some attackers could actually get a hold of this information and use it to breach the company. And then the rules of engagement, the timelines, locations, evidence handling. This also goes into the transfer, how you're going to transfer the evidence. Regular status meetings, time of the day to test. Some companies want to test after hours because maybe you're testing during the day. They don't want their online banking app to be taken down, or any kind of systems that could be processing data, online stores, anything like that. So sometimes they want it done after hours. Sometimes people want it testing after hours. Sometimes one of the disadvantages is you want to if you test during the day, then you can see what it's like with their customer load and how this affects that. Because another thing to look at when you're doing the pen test is seeing how these systems are reacting to the pen tests. And in some cases, systems can be taken down. Some of your older systems, maybe some mainframes, some older network equipment. I've done pen tests before where I was using mass scan, which is a little uh, higher speed uh, vulnerability, or actually a port in service scanner. And I was going through with Nmap and it wasn't quite going quick enough to get through the scope for all the port scanning. So I switched to mass scan. And when I did, they had a couple of older firewalls and it actually rebooted the firewall. So you have to kind of be careful with those stuff. And then I hear the permission to test. So you always have to have permission, legal considerations, and capabilities and technology in place. The legal considerations, a lot of time if you're a consulting company, you're the third party doing a pen test, then your legal department's going to want to look over the the statement of work and the contract, as well as their legal people will want to look at that as well. And a lot of this stuff, as far as you as a pen tester goes, if you're more technical, a lot of this stuff you're not going to get in a lot of depth on, a lot of detail. Some of the stuff you will. If you're working for a smaller company and it's one of these things where everyone's doing everything, then you may have to do more of these items. If you're working internal on a pen testing team, then a lot of cases, they have kind of things set in place that's kind of their standard statement of work, and then just modify the targets and scope and that type of thing, and the time of day. Because if you're internal, you're not really looking at hourly rate and that sort of thing. But and so you can see the scope. So you're going through your questionnaires on your scope. You're doing scoping meetings, and these are really important to get into detail and find out what all is acceptable, and then getting asking questions during the questionnaires. That way you can find out what kind of equipment they have in their environment. You want to ask questions. Do you have older systems or brittle systems in software that may be that they have to watch, so you want to keep an eye on it. So those type of things. And so these questionnaires just help you get all the answers to this stuff, and use that to fill out to design your scope as well as your statement of work. And so here you can see some sample questions, because scoping, this is important. Web application pen testing, how many web applications are being assessed? That's going to be a big difference between 1 and 10 and the amount of time that you're going to have to, and how many login systems are being accessed. And so with this, you may have to have user accounts to do an authenticated test. Sometimes customers just want it to be more black box to just see what an attacker could do. And then others, the more thorough way of doing it is to have accounts for each level. And so you just ask the different questions to make sure that you're covering everything needs to be covered. And then the physical penetration test. So this one, you're telling how many floors, locations. This is another area where you want to make sure you've got the right address, because you don't want to go into the wrong location. Heard an interesting story by Jason Street a couple years ago where he was in Libya or Lebanon, doing a physical pen test for a bank. They were both in the same building, and he actually started pen testing the wrong company, got on their network, plugged in, and luckily the company he was working for, they had told him that, that basically they got a free pen test out of the deal. And luckily he didn't get in trouble over it. So yeah, this is one area that you've got to be really careful. If anyone is familiar with Coalfire, they got in some trouble. Not that they did anything wrong, but they were doing a pen test for a county courthouse, and the pen test was asked for by the state. And physical pen tests, you don't tell people they're coming, because that's how you make sure the test is done thoroughly. And the pen testers went on site to one location, and the door wasn't locking when they left. So they went ahead and set off the alarm, so security or law enforcement would come up and lock the door for them. And so things didn't go as expected. They ended up getting arrested over it, and they're in court over it. It hasn't been settled yet. The county government was mad at the state government for having the pen test done without them knowing. And so they're kind of battling that out in court. So it's just one of the things that's the good thing come out of it is people to cover themselves a little better, make sure they get better documentation, and that way they get their get out. I mean, even though they had the get out of jail free card, this time this situation didn't work out so well. So you want to be careful of that. The physical stuff is a really dangerous stuff because I mean, well, if you're going someplace that depending on the country you're in, the laws, you have to be really careful with that. That's my first opportunity to do a physical penetration test was across the border in Mexico. And there was two reasons I didn't want to go there to do the test. Number one, I hadn't done a physical pen test at that time. And then number two, I didn't speak the language. You know, you get a police officer comes along, you're trying to get into a building. They don't know you from a criminal. You can show them your get out of jail free card, but I wasn't real comfortable with that. And it was also something in our statement of work that whenever we worked on a border town or across the border, that we were sent with a bodyguard. And that kind of scared me off a little more. I thought, you know, if they shoot the bodyguard, what's going to happen next? Then I'm next. So I avoided that. So yeah, you got to be really careful with that. And so some of the interesting things people do is pick locks during these type of engagement, as well as clone uh, the ID cards that allow access to the building. And then social engineering. And this one right here, they said, does the client have a list of email addresses they'd like to social engineer? In some cases, it's interesting. They ask for phone numbers, give targets for the scope to be tested. It's kind of interesting that some of these kind of tests, the customer will want to see if you can actually get that information, if you're able to do reconnaissance and collect that information. I did a test for a large, well, actually it was a hedge fund firm in New York, and I did a test for them, and they wanted us to go out and find the targets and then verify that we could test the targets with them afterwards, which typically you should do the test, but they were kind of leaving out people's relatives that were in the company because they didn't want anyone to look bad. If something happens, they were successfully fished. But in some cases like that, you try to collect the information on the targets because that accomplishes a couple things. Not only are you getting to do your phishing campaign, you're also getting to see what kind of information can be collected by someone malicious on the external. And so here's some of the business units. Sometimes these can be important people to talk to. Sometimes business units are the ones paying for the pen tests. And let's see, like this is the manager aware that a test is about to be performed. So this depends if you're doing like a red team type engagement. Sometimes they may not be known. They may not know about it, but it's typically usually security and IT that doesn't know about these tests just to see their response. So some of the important things too is to know what happens if data gets corrupted or whatever. So documenting all this QA process, have all this, know if they have a disaster recovery procedures in place, which is good. You hope that they do. You hope they have backups, and this is something else. The type of things you'd ask your system administrators, because here they talk about stuff that's fragile. So yeah, you want to document those so you can kind of be careful during a pen test. Then change management procedures. This is also where your backups, making sure things are backed up because you want a good backup in case a system gets corrupted. So here's where you discuss the scope creep as we were talking about. And goals, this is an important one. Every pen test should be goal oriented. Sometimes the goal is for, some kind of PCI requirement, some kind of compliance. So the goal should be, just it can be business oriented, or it could be just to make sure that this web server cannot be exploited from the internet. Just, so you work with the customer, find out their goals on that. And then your primary goals, where you can see here that they're mentioning some compliance in there. Secondary goals are directed to compliance. So yeah, just you want to establish those goals. Some cases, goals aren't established, and then the pen test really doesn't give the results or really help them with what they intended. Then the lines of communications, you want your kind of phone number and email address for the penetration testers, as well as the penetration testers having contacts for people internally, the on-call person, so that way if something goes down, you're able to get a hold of someone and they're able to get it back online by the time business starts back up, if you're doing it after hours. During normal hours, that's kind of one of the advantages of the test being done during business hours. It's easier to have someone on staff to get the system back up and running. As I mentioned, as a pen tester, especially starting out, you're not going to go through a lot of this information, like the using PGP, the encrypted email and storage systems. You do that kind of stuff, but the scoping, as far as the pricing and stuff, whenever you start out, typically you're going to get handed a scope and a statement of work and the goals of the pen test and all that. You have all the information to go by. So this a lot of times is collected by project managers, or the more commonly referred to in consulting as engagement managers, that are managing the pen test to collect this information for you. And pen testers are included on that call. So if you're just getting started out as a pen tester, you may not be the person on the kickoff call. You may be the person doing the pen test afterwards. The scoping calls are usually like the principals and project managers are on the scoping calls, but sometimes you'll be brought into that. And eventually you'll get to the point where you're handling those types of things and helping scoping pen tests. And here was this dealing with shunning. There's times that you may want to be, if it's a web application pen test, then you may want to be whitelisted so you can perform your test. The web application firewall may block stuff, but what happens if that goes down? So you want to be able to test that. Some people want a full black box where if you go to test, you get blocked, that's it. And sometimes that's just not a good use of money. I had a pen test one time. It was one of the first ones, one of my first network pen tests. And I was put in this conference room, plugged into the network. They had a NAC in place to protect uh, their network from someone just plugging in and that type of stuff. And I went in, plugged in, really wasn't able to do anything, but basically they paid for a pen test for me to come in and I couldn't do anything. Now that I've got more experience understanding how to bypass NACs a little bit better than I did then, I had no knowledge on it at the time, would have been a better pen test. And at that point, if you want to test those things, test that as part of the pen test. But if you're going to, if you paid this money for, 40 hours of pen testing, then go ahead and let the pen tester continue after that, document where they're able to bypass the NAC or not. And let's see, capabilities. Okay, or the permission, as we mentioned earlier, the permission to do the pen test, and you want written permission. So they have a document usually, they're going to, you'll sign the document, and if typically if you're working for a pen testing company, then they're going through, or a consulting company, they've got these documents that they've had and they use. Sometimes they may have to alter them for the particular person. Then the legal considerations. So you mentioned here, for example, VoIP calls captured could be considered wiretapping in some areas. So these are, you have to, the legal considerations. And then you think of the other countries too, the laws there. Capabilities and technology in place, ability to detect and respond to information gathering, ability to detect. So this is different things, capabilities in place that they have. So yeah, like they say here, a good pen test doesn't simply check for unpatched systems. So these are the things that you have in mind when you start your pen test.